The Mediterranean, more than 2,000 years ago, was a restless sea of ambition and rivalry. Beneath the warm glow of the sun, fleets of merchant ships carried grain, silver, and slaves across azure waters, their sails billowing like banners of prosperity. But prosperity is fragile, and in this world trade routes were veins of power, lifeblood for empires that dreamed of eternal glory. Two cities separated by culture and destiny, yet bound by geography, were about to collide in a conflict that would reshape the course of history. Rome, a republic still young, its legions hardened by wars with Italian neighbors, stood on the cusp of empire. Carthage, the mistress of the western seas, her harbors filled with towering ships and her coffers swollen by trade, reigned as the queen of Mediterranean commerce. Neither had sought direct confrontation, and yet both were fated to meet in a struggle that would last 23 years, claim hundreds of thousands of lives, and decide the balance of power for centuries to come. Imagine standing on the quays of Carthage in the 3rd century BC. The city rises like a jewel from the North African coast, walls so vast they seem unassailable, enclosing markets where spices from Arabia mingle with gold from the Sahara and tin from distant Britain. The air smells of salt and cedar, for Carthaginian power rests upon her navy, a fleet larger and more experienced than any the world had seen. Generations of seafaring had made the Punic people masters of the waves. From their Phoenician ancestors, they had inherited a skill for navigation that allowed them to explore beyond the Pillars of Hercules and into the unknown Atlantic. Carthage was more than a city. It was an empire of trade, its reach stretching from Spain to Sardinia, from Corsica to the rich fields of Sicily. Cross the sea, and the world changes. Rome, unlike Carthage, was no mercantile empire, but a republic built upon the sweat of farmers and the discipline of soldiers. Its strength did not come from fleets of ships, but from citizen legions, bound together by loyalty to their state. By the mid-3rd century BC, Rome had conquered the Italian peninsula, defeating Etruscan kings, Samnite warriors, and even the war elephants of Pyrrhus of Epirus. The Romans were not yet masters of the Mediterranean, but their resilience and unyielding will had already become legendary. Where Carthage wielded gold, Rome wielded iron. Yet, destiny rarely announces itself. The First Punic War did not begin with an imperial proclamation or a grand strategy to dominate the Mediterranean. It began in a small corner of Sicily, over a city of modest size called Messana, perched at the narrow straits that separate the island from Italy. Here, mercenaries known as the Mamertines seized control, killing citizens and ruling as brigands. Their presence drew the attention of Syracuse, a Greek power that had long contested Sicily's riches. Surrounded and desperate, the Mamertines looked for allies. First, they appealed to Carthage, who saw Sicily as part of her sphere of influence. Then, astonishingly, they turned to Rome. The appeal placed the Republic before a fateful choice. Would Rome remain within the safety of the Italian mainland, or would she cross the waters and enter the world of the great powers? This was the spark. But sparks alone do not ignite infernos. Behind the Mamertines' plea lay deeper currents of rivalry. Sicily was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, fertile and wealthy, its grain essential for feeding populations from Carthage to Rome. Whoever controlled Sicily could feed armies and fleets, and thereby control the Western Sea. For Carthage, Roman intervention was an intrusion into her rightful domain. For Rome, rejecting the Mamertines meant abandoning influence at their doorstep and allowing Carthage to dominate a key strategic island. Pride, fear, and ambition converged, and both republics, once wary but distant, now found themselves on a collision course. The world watched as the Romans debated their choice. Many senators recoiled at the idea of aiding brigands, for the Mamertines had stolen Messana by bloodshed. Yet others argued that Carthaginian presence in Messana was a dagger pointed at Italy's heart. If Rome ceded Sicily, her enemies would one day control the very straits that connected her to the wider world. The decision was made not out of morality, but of necessity. Rome would intervene, legions would march to Messana, and in doing so, they would step onto the stage of Mediterranean history. The Carthaginians, however, were not idle. Already they had placed a garrison in Messana, hoping to secure it before Rome acted. Tension mounted as two great powers maneuvered, each unwilling to yield. The first confrontations were small, almost hesitant, but the die had been cast. Rome and Carthage were no longer distant neighbors, they were enemies, and Sicily was the prize. As the first legions crossed into Sicily, many in Rome still believed this would be a brief campaign, a show of force that would quickly restore balance. Few imagined it would spiral into a grinding war of attrition, lasting nearly a quarter-century. Yet fate has its own designs. The fields of Sicily would soon be trampled by armies, the seas churned by fleets, and the ambitions of two peoples would clash in battle so vast they had no precedent in history. The First Punic War had begun, and the world would never be the same. The Straits of Messana shimmered under the Sicilian sun, but beneath their calm surface, a storm was gathering. To the east lay the city of Messana, seized by the Mamertines, mercenaries without loyalty or law. These men were remnants of Campanian soldiers, once hired by Syracuse, men who turned upon their employers, slaughtered the inhabitants of Messana, and carved out a kingdom of thieves. For years they survived by raiding the countryside, plundering trade routes and terrorizing their neighbors. Their existence was an insult to every power that claimed Sicily, but so long as larger rivals fought one another, the Mamertines endured like wolves scavenging on the edges of civilization. It was inevitable that Syracuse, the greatest of the Greek cities of Sicily, would turn its gaze upon them. Hieron's tent, the tyrant of Syracuse, had recently consolidated his rule, forging alliances and stabilizing a city that had long been torn by factional strife. Unlike many of his predecessors, Hieron was a capable leader, both shrewd and ambitious. He saw in the destruction of the Mamertines not merely vengeance but opportunity. By crushing them, he could secure the straits and extend Syracuse's influence northward. In 265 BC, his army marched, disciplined and eager, against the brigands of Messana. The Mamertines, outnumbered and outmatched, realized they could not stand alone. First, they appealed to Carthage, whose fleet already patrolled the nearby waters. Carthaginian interest in Sicily was long-standing. The island lay at the very center of the Mediterranean, its riches too great to ignore. Carthaginian merchants had long maintained colonies on the western side, Lilybaeum, Motia, Panormus, strongholds from which they watched their Greek and Italic rivals. When the Mamertines extended their desperate plea, Carthage answered, dispatching a garrison to Messana. For Carthage, it was not loyalty but strategy. Controlling Messana meant controlling the straits, cutting Rome from Sicily and keeping Syracuse hemmed in. But here lay the twist of fate. The Mamertines, uneasy with their Carthaginian overlords, feared that the Punic garrison would swallow their independence entirely. These mercenaries, treacherous even in desperation, now turned to Rome. Their appeal landed in the Roman Senate like a thunderbolt. Why should Rome cross the sea to aid brigands? To many patricians, it seemed dishonorable, yet others argued the greater danger. Carthage already occupied the straits. To allow this foothold was to invite Punic power onto Italy's doorstep. The debate was fierce, echoing through the marble halls of the Senate. At last, the decision was made. Rome would intervene. Thus, in 264 BC, the legions crossed into Sicily for the first time in history. Consul Appius Claudius Caudex led the expedition, determined to assert Roman power. His troops landed near Messana, the red banners of the Republic fluttering above their camps. Carthage, unwilling to retreat, prepared to contest the landing. Syracuse, eager to crush the Mamertines, also advanced. For a brief moment, Messana stood as the eye of a hurricane, with three great powers converging upon it: the Romans, the Carthaginians, and the Syracusans. The first clash was not one of epic armies, but of posturing and positioning. Carthage sought to negotiate, attempting to hold Messana without bloodshed. Rome, however, had made its choice and would not withdraw. Tensions snapped, and the conflict erupted. Appius Claudius led his men against the Syracusans, defeating them in battle, and forcing Hieron II to retreat behind the walls of Syracuse. The victory was swift and decisive, a demonstration that Roman legions could operate on Sicilian soil. In the aftermath, Hieron weighed his position carefully. Syracuse was strong, but not strong enough to withstand both Rome and Carthage. Recognizing the shifting balance, Hieron made a choice that would alter the war's course. He allied with Rome, supplying the legions with grain, money, and support. From that moment onward, Syracuse became a steadfast partner of Rome, freeing the Republic from concerns in eastern Sicily and allowing it to focus upon Carthage. For the Carthaginians, this turn of events was alarming. What had begun as a minor intervention had now drawn Rome into Sicily permanently. The Punic garrison withdrew from Messana, but Carthage prepared for a wider war. The island, once a patchwork of rival cities and mercenary bands, now became the battleground of giants. The campaigns that followed spread across the fertile plains and rugged hills of Sicily. Roman legions, accustomed to land warfare, advanced methodically, besieging Carthaginian strongholds. Yet for all their discipline, the Romans found themselves checked. Carthage avoided decisive engagements on land, preferring instead to rely upon her superior navy. With control of the seas, Carthaginian fleets cut Roman supply lines and reinforced garrisons at will. It soon became clear that if Rome wished to defeat Carthage, it could not rely upon its legions alone. The war would be decided not just on the fields of Sicily, but upon the waves of the Mediterranean. The First Punic War, in its opening years, was already unlike any conflict Rome had fought before. No longer was the enemy a neighboring tribe or Italian kingdom. Now the adversary was a maritime empire, wealthy, resourceful, and experienced in wars beyond Italy. For the first time, Rome faced a contest that would test not just the courage of her soldiers, but the very adaptability of her people. In the markets of Carthage, merchants whispered uneasily of Rome's persistence. In the Senate of Rome, senators spoke of honor, fear, and the need for victory. Across Sicily, cities wavered, some siding with Rome, others with Carthage, all caught in the grinding wheels of war. And in Messana, the Mamertines watched, astonished, as their desperate gamble had set two great powers on a path toward destruction. What neither Rome nor Carthage yet knew was that this war would outlast generations. Fathers would fight, and their sons would fight after them, until exhaustion itself became the final arbiter. Yet in these early days, the struggle was still young, and the shape of the contest was not yet clear. Only one thing was certain: Sicily had become the crucible in which the fates of Rome and Carthage would be forged. The early years of the war revealed a truth Rome could no longer ignore. On land, the legions were formidable, their discipline and tactics overwhelming local resistance. But Sicily was an island, and islands are ruled not by armies, but by fleets. Carthage knew this well. Her triremes and quinqueremes dominated the Mediterranean, their prows cutting through the waters with speed and grace. To the Punic commanders, the Romans seemed like stubborn farmers, valiant perhaps, but chained to the soil, incapable of matching Carthage upon the waves. If the Republic dared to extend itself across the sea, Carthage believed, her navy would strangle Rome as surely as a cord tightens around the throat of a man. And at first they were right. Roman supply lines faltered, campaigns in Sicily dragged, not because the legions lacked courage, but because Carthaginian fleets could strike at will, bringing reinforcements, intercepting grain, and raiding coastal settlements in Italy itself. For Rome, the realization was bitter. To fight Carthage, she must become what she had never been before, a naval power. The challenge was daunting. Rome possessed few ships, and her sailors were fishermen, not seasoned warriors of the sea. But where other nations might hesitate, Rome acted with astonishing speed. The Senate decreed the construction of a fleet, not of dozens, but of hundreds of ships. Legend tells that the Romans, having captured a single Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground, used it as a model. From this solitary vessel, they built an entire navy, copying its design plank for plank. Within months, Roman shipyards thundered with the sound of hammers, and a fleet of over 100 warships emerged, as if conjured from the earth. Yet the Romans knew they could not simply copy Carthage's strength. On the open sea, Punic seamanship would always prevail. Rome needed innovation, something that could transform her soldiers' skill on land into an advantage afloat. The answer came in the form of a brutal device, the corvus. The corvus was a boarding bridge, a massive gangplank with an iron spike at its end. Mounted on the prow of Roman ships, it could be dropped onto an enemy vessel, driving the spike into the deck and holding the two ships together. In that moment, the sea became land. Roman legionaries, veterans of countless battles, could storm across the plank and turn a naval encounter into a melee of shields and swords. It was a simple, almost crude invention, but its impact was revolutionary. The first test came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. The Roman fleet, commanded by Gaius Duilius, sailed to meet the Carthaginian navy, which outnumbered and outclassed them in experience. The Punic commanders, confident in their superiority, charged directly at the clumsy Roman line. But as the Carthaginian ships closed, the corvée dropped. Roman soldiers swarmed across the gangways, clashing with Punic crews in vicious hand-to-hand combat. Ship after ship fell, boarded and captured. What should have been a Carthaginian victory turned into a stunning Roman triumph. The sea, once the Punic domain, had been invaded by land. Rome had found a way to fight on her own terms. For the first time in history, Carthage's naval supremacy was challenged. The victory at Mylae electrified the Roman people. In honor of Duilius, a column was raised in the Forum, adorned with the prows of captured ships, a reminder to every citizen that Rome was no longer bound to the land, but had taken its first steps toward mastery of the sea. Yet the struggle was far from over. Carthage adapted, seeking ways to counter the corvus. Naval battles grew larger, more ferocious, fleets clashing by the hundreds. At Cape Ecnomus in 256 BC, the two sides fought what would become one of the largest naval battles in antiquity, with nearly 700 ships engaged. The clash was titanic, the sea boiling with shattered hulls and drowning men. Once again, Roman discipline and the corvus tipped the scales. The Carthaginian fleet was broken, and Rome seized the initiative. Emboldened by victory, the Senate authorized a daring move. No longer content to fight in Sicily, Rome would carry the war into Africa itself, striking at the heart of Carthage. Legions embarked, their ships forming a vast armada that sailed across the Mediterranean, bound for the Punic homeland. For the first time, Carthage would face the terror of invasion, her fields and cities threatened by foreign soldiers. But hubris is a dangerous companion. While the corvus had given Rome victories, it also made her ships top-heavy, prone to disaster in storms. As the great fleet returned from Africa, it was struck by violent weather. Hundreds of vessels sank, tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors drowned. The sea, indifferent to the ambitions of men, exacted its price. Rome wept, but Rome did not yield. Even in the face of catastrophic loss, the Republic rebuilt her fleets again and again, Each disaster a lesson, each defeat a spur to greater effort. Carthage, too, felt the strain. Her navy remained powerful, her coffers deep, but the Roman persistence was unlike anything she had encountered. Most enemies, once beaten at sea, would submit. Rome rebuilt, returned, and fought harder. The Punic commanders began to see that this war would not be decided in a single battle. It was a contest of endurance, of wealth, of sheer determination. And so the struggle widened. Sicily, once the spark, now became the anvil upon which Rome and Carthage hammered one another. Armies marched across its valleys, fleets battled along its coasts, and its cities, caught between giants, suffered siege, famine, and ruin. In this crucible, both empires would be tested as never before, and the question loomed ever larger. Which power had the strength to outlast the other? The year was 256 BC, and the Mediterranean seemed to tilt in Rome's favor. The triumph at Cape Ignomus had not only shattered a Carthaginian fleet, but opened a path few Romans had dared to imagine. The Senate, emboldened by success, decreed that the war would no longer be confined to Sicily. Instead, the legions would cross the sea and strike Carthage itself. The decision was audacious, for never before had Rome attempted such an expedition. Yet the Republic was aflame with confidence. The Punic capital, seat of merchant princes and naval lords, would now face the iron tread of Roman soldiers. The armada gathered was immense, hundreds of ships bearing tens of thousands of legionaries. As the vessels set sail, their prows cutting through the waves, the Roman people looked on in awe. This was no mere raid, but an invasion aimed at the heart of their greatest rival. The gods themselves seemed to be watching as the fleet, like a swarm of locusts, crossed the sea. Carthage, long secure behind her fleets, now trembled at the thought of Roman swords upon her soil. The landing in Africa was swift and overwhelming. Roman forces disembarked near the Cape Bon Peninsula and began ravaging the countryside, burning farms, seizing villages, and sowing terror. Carthage, unaccustomed to war on her own doorstep, faltered. The Punic Senate, used to waging war abroad through mercenaries and fleets, suddenly faced devastation in their own fields. The Republic of Merchants found itself tested in a way it had not been for centuries. Command of the Roman army fell to Marcus Atilius Regulus, a consul whose name would echo through history, though not as he might have wished. Regulus was bold, aggressive, and utterly convinced of Rome's destiny. His legions marched inland, and Carthaginian resistance crumbled. Towns surrendered, mercenary forces melted away, and the countryside burned. For a moment it seemed Rome might achieve in a single campaign what had once seemed unthinkable: the total defeat of Carthage. The Punic Senate, desperate, sued for peace, but Regulus, inflated with arrogance, demanded terms so harsh they amounted to surrender. Carthage would abandon her navy, pay crushing indemnities, and cede vast territories. To the Carthaginians, these terms were unbearable, not merely loss, but humiliation. They chose instead to fight, no matter the cost. In their desperation, the Carthaginians turned to foreign aid, seeking a commander who could match the discipline of the Roman legions. Their appeal was answered by a Spartan, Xanthippus, a mercenary general of uncommon skill. Where Punic commanders had faltered, Xanthippus saw clarity. He reorganized Carthage's forces, drilling them in phalanx formation, restoring order to troops long disheartened. Most crucially, he understood the power of the war elephant, those massive beasts whose thunderous charge could shatter even the bravest infantry. When Regulus marched to meet the Carthaginians near Tunis, he found not the disorganized foe he had once crushed, but an army reborn. Xanthippus deployed the elephants in a line, supported by disciplined infantry and cavalry on the flanks. The Romans, drawn up in their familiar formations, advanced with confidence. But as the elephants charged, the ground itself seemed to quake. Legionaries, veterans of countless land battles, were thrown into chaos. Their lines buckled, their shields splintered beneath tusks and trampling feet. Carthaginian cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting down those who fled. What began as battle became slaughter. Regulus himself was captured, his once proud army annihilated. Of the tens of thousands who had landed in Africa, only a fraction returned. Rome's great gamble had ended in disaster, and the Carthaginians, once at the brink of ruin, now stood revived, their pride restored. Yet the war was not over. Even as Carthage celebrated, Rome prepared once more to rebuild. The Republic's resilience was astonishing, its capacity for loss matched only by its determination to rise again. Fleets were constructed anew, legions conscripted, and Sicily once more became the stage of conflict. But the lesson of Regulus's campaign lingered. Overconfidence had nearly undone Rome, while Carthage had learned that with the right leadership, she could strike devastating blows. The struggle between these two powers had entered a new phase, one where neither could easily triumph, and where victory would belong not to the swift or the bold, but to the side that could endure the longest. In Carthage, statues of the war elephants were raised in gratitude, and the name of Xanthippus was spoken with reverence. In Rome, the fate of Regulus became legend, retold with embellishments, that made him a symbol of sacrifice and stoic endurance. Some said that when Carthage later sent him to Rome to negotiate peace, he refused to urge his people towards submission, choosing instead to return to Carthaginian captivity and his death. Whether true or myth, the story captured the Roman spirit. Even in defeat, they claimed a kind of moral victory. The war ground on. Sicily, the jewel both powers coveted, became a wasteland of ruined cities and starving fields. Carthaginian strongholds like Lilybaeum and Drepana defied Roman sieges, their walls supplied endlessly by the Punic navy. Roman soldiers, hardened but weary, bled and died for gains that seemed fleeting. Carthaginian mercenaries, fierce but faithless, fought for coin rather than homeland. It was a war of exhaustion, and yet neither side could let go. The invasion of Africa had changed everything. No longer could Carthage dismiss Rome as an upstart land power. No longer could Rome imagine victory as swift or inevitable. Both now knew the other's strength, and both understood the price of miscalculation. The First Punic War had revealed itself for what it was, not a border dispute, not a campaign for glory, but a struggle for survival, one that would drag on until one side broke under the weight of its own losses. And still the greatest battles lay ahead, on seas where storms and steel would decide the fate of empires. The catastrophe of Regulus's defeat echoed across the Mediterranean, but Rome, true to her nature, did not falter. Within months of the slaughter near Tunis, the Republic set itself once more to the hammering labor of war. Shipyards roared with activity, forests fell to supply timber, and fresh legions drilled upon the Campus Martius. Carthage had won a reprieve, but not peace. The war returned to Sicily, and with it came the grinding struggle that would drag on for years. The island, once fertile and prosperous, had become a chessboard of sieges and counter-sieges. Carthaginian strongholds, Lilybaeum, Drepana, Panormus, stood like thorns in the Roman advance. Their harbors, guarded by Punic fleets, kept them supplied despite the legions that surrounded their walls. Time and again, Roman commanders attempted to storm these cities, only to be repelled by a combination of engineering, Punic determination, and the steady flow of reinforcements from across the sea. The lesson was clear. Sicily could not be taken by land alone. Victory demanded mastery of the waters. And so the naval war intensified. By now, Rome had grown accustomed to the sea, her sailors hardened, her commanders more confident. The corvus still loomed as a fearsome weapon, but Carthaginian admirals had begun to adapt, avoiding close encounters where Roman boarding tactics could prevail. Instead, they relied on speed, maneuver, and the age-old art of the ram, splintering enemy hulls and sending ships to the bottom. It was in these years that some of the greatest sea battles in history were fought. In 249 BC, off the coast, near Drepana, the Roman fleet under Publius Claudius Pulcher sought to deliver a decisive blow. Pulcher, scion of a proud patrician house, was bold but reckless. As his ships assembled, he consulted the sacred chickens, a ritual meant to divine the will of the gods. When the birds refused to eat, an omen of disaster, Pulcher is said to have sneered, declaring, "If they will not eat, then let them drink," and cast them into the sea. The gods, it seemed, were not amused. Pulcher's fleet launched a surprise attack on the Carthaginian harbor at Drepana, but discipline faltered. The Carthaginian admiral Adherbal, cool and decisive, led his ships in a brilliant counterstroke. The Romans, caught in confusion, lost nearly 100 vessels. Pulcher fled in disgrace, recalled to Rome in shame. The defeat at Drepana was one of the worst naval disasters in Roman history, a bitter reminder that hubris could bring ruin as swiftly as any Punic spear. But even in defeat, Rome did not surrender the sea. Another consul, Lucius Junius Pullus, soon after led a fleet laden with supplies for the legions besieging Lilybaeum. Carthage, eager to strike, dispatched her admiral Carthallo. In the ensuing battle near Fintius, Roman incompetence once again proved fatal. Many ships ran aground, others were destroyed, and storms compounded the disaster. Thousands of men drowned, their cries swallowed by the merciless waves. For a time, it seemed Carthage had regained her mastery of the waters. The Punic fleets roamed with confidence, raiding Italy's coasts, cutting Roman supply lines and mocking the Senate's inability to protect its own shores. Morale sagged, and many in Rome questioned whether the war could be won at all. And yet, as always, Rome's strength lay not in brilliance but in endurance. Each defeat only steeled the Republic's resolve. By 247 BC, a new figure emerged to lead Carthaginian resistance in Sicily. Hamilcar Barca, a man whose name would one day echo through the annals of history as the father of Hannibal. Hamilcar was young, daring, and unafraid to strike boldly against overwhelming odds. Establishing a base on Mount Erecte near Panormus, he launched guerrilla raids that harassed Roman positions, striking where least expected and retreating before counterattack. His leadership inspired hope in a Carthage weary of endless war. Yet even Hamilcar could not change the fundamental balance. Carthage still ruled the waves, but her resources dwindled. The mercenaries she relied upon demanded ever more pay, and the wealth of her trading empire, strained by years of conflict, began to falter. Rome, battered but relentless, continued to pour men and timber into the fight. By 243 BC, the Senate resolved to raise yet another fleet, funded not by the treasury, bankrupted by earlier disasters, but by private citizens who loaned money in the belief that victory would repay all debts. It was a gamble, not unlike the one Rome had made at the war year's beginning, bold, desperate, and fueled by faith in destiny. This new fleet was built without the cumbersome corvus, the device abandoned as too dangerous in storms. Instead, Roman seamanship had matured, their sailors more confident, their tactics sharper. Carthage, exhausted, could not match this sudden surge. The final confrontation loomed, a clash that would decide not only the fate of Sicily, but the fate of empires. The war had already consumed 2 decades. Generations of soldiers had marched and died, fortunes had been won and lost, and yet neither side had broken. Now, the moment of decision approached. The seas off the western coast of Sicily would soon run red once more, and in that crucible the First Punic War would at last reach its climax. The struggle entered its 3rd decade, and the First Punic War seemed as if it might stretch on without end. Sicily lay ravaged, her fields burned, her cities scarred by siege. Generations of soldiers had come and gone, entire families had given their sons to the conflict, and yet Rome and Carthage remained locked in combat. The war had become more than a contest for an island. It had become a test of wills, a duel between 2 civilizations, each unwilling to concede even the smallest measure of defeat. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion that Hamilcar Barca emerged as the guiding spirit of Carthaginian resistance. Young, fiery, and brimming with audacity, Hamilcar understood that he could not defeat Rome outright. Instead, he sought to wage a war of endurance, keeping Roman forces off balance, striking suddenly, and vanishing into the Sicilian hills. From his stronghold on Mount Erecte, overlooking Panormus, he waged a campaign unlike anything the Romans had faced before. With a small force of veterans and mercenaries, he launched lightning raids against supply lines, destroyed Roman camps, and harried their garrisons until no part of western Sicily felt secure. For years, he kept the Romans guessing, forcing them to scatter their strength in futile chases. When pressure mounted on one front, Hamilcar shifted to another, slipping away into mountain passes or across the sea to launch daring raids against the Italian coast itself. The Romans came to respect, even fear, his name, though they would never admit it openly. His leadership injected new hope into a weary Carthage, convincing many that, given time, the Republic might collapse under the sheer weight of attrition. But Rome did not collapse. Rome endured. Even as Hamilcar bled them with 1,000 cuts, the Senate planned for decisive action. By 243 BC, the Republic resolved that the only way to end the war was by destroying Carthage's naval supremacy once and for all. Yet the treasury was empty, drained by decades of campaigning. It was then that Rome turned to her own citizens. Wealthy aristocrats and common traders alike contributed funds, building ships at their own expense in the belief that victory would bring repayment and glory. Out of this collective sacrifice, a new fleet was born, 300 vessels strong, each designed for speed and maneuver, rather than the clumsy reliance on the corvus. The new fleet, entrusted to the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, became a symbol of Rome's indomitable will. Training was rigorous. The crews drilled endlessly until Roman seamanship rivaled that of their Punic enemies. Carthage, by contrast, struggled to muster an opposing force. Her economy was strained, her mercenaries restless, her once mighty navy reduced by years of attrition and neglect. Hamilcar could hold the land, but without the sea, Sicily was doomed. The decisive moment came in 241 BC off the Aegates Islands, a cluster of rocky isles near the western tip of Sicily. Carthage, desperate to relieve her garrisons at Lilybaeum and Drepana, dispatched a fleet loaded with supplies and reinforcements. The ships were heavy, their holds crammed with grain, weapons, and men. They sailed straight into the path of Catulus, who had been waiting for just such an opportunity. The morning of the battle dawned cold and stormy, the wind whipping across the waves. The Carthaginian fleet, weighed down and ill-prepared, found itself facing the lean, well-trained Roman squadrons. Catulus, though injured and unable to stand, directed operations from a stretcher on the deck, his determination unshaken. At his signal, the Roman ships advanced in disciplined lines, their oars churning the sea in perfect rhythm. The clash was brutal and swift. Carthage's overloaded ships struggled to maneuver, their decks crowded with soldiers unused to naval fighting. The Romans pressed in, ramming with precision, splintering hulls and overwhelming the enemy with relentless assaults. Time and again, Punic vessels were surrounded, their crews slaughtered or dragged into captivity. The sea foamed red with blood and wreckage. By the day's end, the Carthaginian fleet was annihilated. Over 50 ships were sunk, 70 more captured, and thousands of men killed or enslaved. The remainder fled in disarray, carrying with them the bitter truth: Carthage could fight no longer. Sicily was lost, and with it, the war. The news struck Carthage like a thunderbolt. For over 2 decades she had fought Rome as an equal, sometimes victorious, sometimes humbled, but always resilient. Now, for the first time, she was forced to sue for peace. Hamilcar Barca, undefeated in the field, was ordered to negotiate terms he found intolerable. Rome demanded Sicily in its entirety, the evacuation of all Punic garrisons, and an indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver to be paid over 10 years. It was a harsh settlement, stripping Carthage of her richest colony and plunging her into financial strain. Yet she had no choice. The First Punic War was over. For Rome, the victory was transformative. From a land-based republic, cautious and provincial, she had emerged as a naval power of the first rank, her fleets ruling the central Mediterranean. The conquest of Sicily marked Rome's first province beyond the Italian peninsula, the beginning of an empire that would one day span continents. But the triumph was not without cost. Tens of thousands of Romans had perished, the treasury was drained, and the scars of 23 years of war ran deep. For Carthage, the defeat was devastating but not final. Though stripped of Sicily, she retained her wealth, her fleets, and her ambition. Men like Hamilcar Barca would not accept humiliation lightly. Retreating to Africa, he swore to restore Carthage's fortunes, turning his eyes toward Spain as a new base of power. There, his son Hannibal would one day swear his own oath of eternal enmity toward Rome, setting the stage for an even greater conflict. The First Punic War had ended, but the rivalry had only just begun. The Mediterranean would not know peace for long, for Rome and Carthage were now bound by fate to clash again, in wars still more terrible than the first. Yet for the moment, as Rome celebrated her hard-won triumph and Carthage licked her wounds, the long shadow of history stretched forward, foreshadowing the titanic struggles yet to come. The smoke of battle had cleared, but the echoes of the First Punic War lingered long after the last trireme had sunk beneath the waves. For 23 years, Rome and Carthage had fought with a ferocity the ancient world had rarely seen, a struggle of such endurance that many wondered how either republic could survive it, yet survive they did, though not unchanged. Rome, victorious but scarred, had tested her strength against a great maritime empire and emerged transformed. What had begun as a land war for control of Messana had evolved into a clash across seas, coasts, and continents. In defeating Carthage, Rome had not only claimed Sicily, the jewel of the Western Mediterranean, but also proven that her power was not confined to Italy. The Republic had learned to build fleets, to fight at sea, and to project power far beyond her borders. Sicily became Rome's first province, governed not as an ally, but as a possession, a model that would shape the future of Roman imperial expansion. But the costs were staggering. Tens of thousands of Roman citizens had fallen in the endless sieges and naval disasters. The Senate had emptied its treasury again and again, relying at times on the private wealth of citizens to fund the war. Entire generations of young men had been consumed by the struggle. Victory was theirs, but it was purchased with blood and hardship. For Carthage, the war was a humiliation. Her long-standing dominance at sea had been broken, her proud colonies in Sicily stripped away, and her people burdened with a crushing indemnity. Worse still, the reliance on mercenary soldiers had sown seeds of discord. When the war ended and Carthage delayed their payment, those same mercenaries would revolt in fury, plunging the city into the terrifying mercenary war, a conflict so brutal that Carthage nearly ceased to exist. Only through the desperate leadership of Hamilcar Barca was the rebellion crushed, though the scars remained. Yet defeat did not mean destruction. Carthage's mercantile genius endured, her fleets still plied the seas, and her leaders began to look for new horizons. The Barcid family, led by Hamilcar, saw in Spain a land rich in silver and soldiers, a place where Carthage could rebuild her strength and dream once again of challenging Rome. There, among the rugged hills and fertile valleys of Iberia, Hamilcar's son Hannibal would grow, nurtured in an atmosphere of vengeance. According to legend, the boy swore an oath at his father's altar, never to be a friend to Rome. Thus, the First Punic War, though concluded, was not the end, but the beginning. It was the first act in a trilogy of conflicts that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. Rome had won Sicily, but Carthage had not been destroyed, and so long as both powers endured, rivalry was inevitable. The war had proven that neither could tolerate the other as an equal, and destiny had already written the next chapter. When the two powers met again, it would not be in the narrow straits of Sicily alone, but across Italy, Spain, Africa, and beyond. Hannibal, son of Hamilcar, would carry the Carthaginian cause into the very heart of Rome's dominion, marching elephants across the Alps in one of the most daring campaigns the world has ever known. Rome, for her part, would rise to meet him with all the resilience that had carried her through the first struggle. The First Punic War ended in 241 BC, but in truth, it never truly ended. It set into motion a cycle of vengeance, ambition, and survival that would rage for nearly a century. From the ashes of Sicily's battlefields rose an empire, and from the humiliation of defeat, a thirst for revenge that would shake the ancient world. The Mediterranean had a new master, but her rule was not yet secure. The long rivalry of Rome and Carthage had only just begun, and the greatest trials lay ahead.